every week. There, we're
Sounds
officially
good.
recording.
Yeah. We'll give people a few more minutes. There's usually more than 5 of us here. Is anyone located on the East Coast and getting hammered with snow?
We're East Coast-ish out in Michigan. Definitely didn't get the stuff that the East Coast did, but definitely had to shovel the driveway.
Yeah. Mike, have you been up to Tahoe? Is it madhouse up there? You're staying away?
Yeah, we're staying away. It seems like it's a madhouse there. So.
Yeah, I can imagine. All right, let's do one more minute and we'll start at 9:03. Here's the agenda and meeting notes. I'll paste in the chat as usual. Cool. All right, well, we can get started. The first thing is just a quick little plug. I wrote up a roundup post with the help of all the presenters for a lot of the presentations we've had in this working group so far. So if you haven't been able to make one of them or curious, like take a look at that and you can kind of just see a quick summary. I think it's been really, really awesome to have all these, so I put that out there. I think the Debian one is missing. I couldn't find the recording, but we could add that at another point if people are, or if Enrico is interested in helping me do that. So yeah, so that's just a quick plug for that. And then today I think Jacob is going to be presenting to us about, I have no idea how to pronounce the name of that. So.
You are not alone there. One of my biggest regrets is the name of this tool. It is a Crexcavator or CR Excavator. I have this convo every time I talk about this. So.
Nice. Well, yeah, feel free to intro yourself and take it away if you want.
Great. Yeah, I've got a slide deck here. I'm going to share. One moment, sorry. We're a WebEx shop out at Cisco, so not used to the share tab option. All right.
So my apologies. Who's our presenter? Jacob Rickardy?
Yeah.
Rickard? How do you pronounce Rickard? Jacob Rickard. Rickard. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Hey. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to be talking a bit about a tool we created called CR Excavator. Zach Steinler is a colleague of mine and attended your last meeting and thought how Duo tackled our like trust issue with Chrome extensions and how we think about like trust and risk scores in the context of this tool might be useful for this group. And Dan thought so as well. So I'm happy to talk to you all today. Cool. So my name is Jacob Rickard. I'm a senior security engineer at Duo/Cisco, former Amazon security engineer, and y'all can follow me on Twitter at CRExpert. I got a thing for that name, unfortunately. Cool. So this is the first meeting I've been able to attend from this group, but I did watch the last meeting with Michael talking a lot about federation. And I checked out the GitHub, and I think where I'm going to be able to provide the most value today is talking about risk and trust from the perspective of a consumer who had a problem with needing to evaluate the trustworthiness, the risk that browser extensions had throughout their org and the solutions we came up with. And I know browser extensions aren't exactly open source software, but I think they can have a lot of the same risks, and I think y'all will be able to get some value out of this today. Cool. So I adapted this talk from one I gave shortly pre-COVID. I'm going to breeze through a number of these sections and focus more a bit about risk from browser extensions and the trouble with risk scores. I'm not trying to sell you anything today. Don't worry, Excavator is free. You can buy it if you wanted. Use it, don't use it. It doesn't really matter too much. But I'm going to go a bit about how browser extensions work, how we think about browser extensions, a bit of some research findings we found. Going to go over the tool we created, and then spend some time talking about the challenges we found when trying to create risk scores. So every time I give a talk about browser extensions, I like to add some headlines here. And these are very FUD and fear-mongery, but as we do more in the browser these days, between consumers doing banking and email to organizations managing production infrastructure in the browser, browser extensions are often a forgotten attack surface here. And you can see, like, Google removes malicious Chrome extensions with 500,000 downloads, and Google removes Chrome extension botnet, and Chrome extensions from North Korea, Chrome extensions with adware, Chrome extensions stealing credit card info. And like I said, these are pretty fuddy. And at Duo, we don't like to spread FUD. So I'm going to give you some tools to try to tackle this today. But in reality, our CISO isn't staying up late at night, losing sleep over Chrome extensions from North Korea, right? The real risk can come from a couple categories here. One of the main ones is when a extension that is popular and has a lot of users is sold to a different party. And then that different party will push an update to the extension and then can access users' data or interact with their page or production infrastructure. And I thought this one was particularly interesting for this group because in the last talk, Michael, the presenter, was very into the idea of digital identities should be linked back to real world person identities. And I think I agree with his assessment there. And I know this group is talking about having the concept of having a digital identity separate from a real world identity. But when that identity can potentially be bought and sold and change hands, there can become these scenarios where the Great Suspender, for example, was a recent extension that was sold, I believe, in June. And there's nothing stating that extension developers have to disclose when they sell their extensions. They could just hand over their Google account if they really want. And when that happens, that new owner took the extension, pushed an update that started collecting more user analytics, collecting user data. It actually got removed from the Microsoft Store, I believe, at one point. Some researchers were finding that they had some analytics software that was like pretending to be a certain analytics software, but was actually something else, and a lot more sketchy stuff happening there. And at Duo, we've seen when we've had incidents around browser extensions, they're often when a previously good and trusted extension turned malicious, either through being sold, or the other example here, when that extension is forcibly taken over. And a real-life example of this one was Mega. A couple years ago, the Mega extension, a developer account was hacked, and malicious actors pushed an update to the extension that started stealing usernames and passwords, and I even think some Bitcoin wallet keys and stuff. And that was a number of users that were unsuspectingly affected. And one of the issues with browser extensions specifically is that there's no easy way to version pin extensions. So if there's a new update, the extension will automatically be updated silently without the user knowing. And yes, technically, if they add a new warnable permission, the extension will be disabled and the user will have to re-enable the extension. But oftentimes, if they buy an extension that already has a lot of access, they don't need to add any more to accomplish their goals. So I'm going to quickly go over what is a Chrome extension. So this group has some baseline knowledge to help understand the rest of the talk today. I could give a whole talk on this, but we don't have that kind of time today. But basically, all you need to know is that a browser extension has this manifest.json file, which is kind of the heart and soul of the extension. And there's many more keys than this, but some of the most important ones are permissions, which can define what an extension is allowed to do and what it can access. Optional permissions, which are the same as permissions, but the only difference is that they require a user to click yes when they're used and consent to it. Content scripts, which is JavaScript that runs in the context of the page they're currently viewing. Background scripts, which is JavaScript that runs in the context of the extension itself. It can also pass messages between these scripts because each script has a different level of permissions they're allowed to use. And content security policies, which can limit where an extension is allowed to make calls to or load resources from. Here's a quick example of what permissions look like. At the top there, stuff like all URLs, like 3 stars, HTTPS star, HTTP star. Google will warn on these permissions with read and change all your data on the websites you visit. If you've ever installed a browser extension, you might have seen a little pop-up that warns on what the extension can do, and these permissions directly affect what warnings will appear there. Also, you've got a history permission, which can read and change your browsing history, privacy, which can change your privacy-related settings, and there are dozens more. I like to show this example too whenever I talk about browser extensions, because I'm a Reddit user, and on the AWS subreddit a while ago, I saw a post where someone said, "I made a Chrome extension to color the console header depending on the region. Do you find this idea interesting?" And this is kind of the exact problem that we try to tackle with browser extensions, right? Where this is a legitimately useful idea, right? If you ever use the AWS console, you can sometimes lose track of what region you're on. And it seemed like a lot of other people agreed with this. It's got a high number of upvotes. It's got gold. It's got silver. And this is legitimately a good idea, but I would never trust this browser extension in my org. And a lot of people on Reddit are smart, TM, and somebody commented something similar, being like, hey, like this is a big security risk, because in order for this extension to change this, it has to have access to your console. And be able to run some JavaScript to change the CSS there. But then another smart Reddit user commented on that comment saying, hey, well, actually, I review the source code of all extensions that I install, and I reviewed this one, and it was fine. It was only 25 lines of JavaScript, and it didn't steal any of my data. And that's where the conversation fizzled out there. But got a quick question. Feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me if you've got questions as well. I might have missed some earlier. 1 second. Is this where a simple user script rather than a complete extension would make more sense? Yeah, something like this. You could, if you've got something like Grease Monkey, assuming you trust this, or you could write your own simple thing to do this. No worries at all. But yeah, there's often simpler solutions to a lot of the problems people try to solve with these, but users often go for convenience over having to go the more secure route. And I assume this extension would be popular if it was released. But anyways, this is a perfect example of something that a threat actor might want to purchase if a number of users have this installed and is having access to production data, right? And without users knowing, it could be purchased, it could change hands, push a new update, and start running amok with their production infrastructure. So that's kind of the wrong window. That's some of the problems that browser extensions can face, right? But once upon a time at Duo, users were allowed to install whatever extensions they wanted, and we didn't track browser extension risk as much. And we later decided that was a problem, and we need to get a handle on this. So we gathered every extension that was currently installed across any endpoint throughout Duo, and we made an explicit allow list. Quick side note, I'm going to be using terms like explicit allow list and allow lists in this presentation to replace less inclusive terms like whitelist and blacklist. You might still see screenshots with that terminology in the tool. We are working on moving to more inclusive language shortly. But we wanted to create a explicit allow list. So we collected every extension and froze that in time and said, this is the list today. That wasn't very disruptive for users, since any extension that they already had was still allowed, but any new extensions had to be reviewed by our SecOps team. And over time, we would tackle the currently allowed list and trim it down to something we are more comfortable with. But then we had a new problem, right? How do you assess the risk that an extension provides or can contribute to your org? How do you trust this extension? And extensions are really just HTML and JavaScript, mostly JavaScript. And not everyone on our SecOps team was JavaScript security experts. And even if they were, have fun going through 6 megabytes of minified JavaScript and doing that multiple times. So we needed a different solution. And when we reviewed extensions, we wanted to ensure that they didn't have any high-risk permissions that they didn't need, that they did not connect to anything suspicious or unordinary. They didn't talk to any external services. These last two are important because any extensions, well, we found a lot of extensions are really just interfaces for a SaaS service. And if we use a SaaS service at Duo, it has to go through a vendor review process. So Crexcavator can help us determine that. That it doesn't use any libraries that contain known vulnerabilities. It doesn't incorporate any externally hosted JavaScript, because then the JavaScript could be changed without pushing a new update to the extension and then affect the behavior of the extension. Have several hundred 4- or 5-star reviews. This is a lot less important, especially since we learned that there's a lot of fake reviews on extensions, but it's still nice to see. Has a privacy policy, and developer information is listed on the web store. And there's not already a related extension that can accomplish the same task that's less risky. So how can we determine this? Well, in came Crexcavator. So Crexcavator is a tool we made that started off as an internal solution to programmatically determine the risk that a extension provides. It was useful enough for us that we decided to release it publicly, and we've been operating it for about 2 years now with a fair amount of interest. And when we released it, we did some research into the Chrome Web Store, and these are stats from 2 years ago, so they're not accurate as of today. But when we did this, we found that 85% of extensions didn't have a privacy policy. 3/4 didn't have a support site. 1/3 could read your data on any site. 1/3 had libraries with known vulnerabilities. 15% had both known vulnerabilities and could read your data on any site, and 9% could read your cookies. This paints a bleak picture, but I want to give credit to Google, and not just because there are Googlers on this call. Google's been moving in the right direction with browser extensions, with stuff like Manifest v3, having stricter review policies, having its data protection bug bounty, which I've been able to collect a few dollars from, which is neat. and requiring more extensions to have privacy policies, and requiring extensions to list why they need permissions, which is great to see. And there's definitely still a long ways to go, but they're moving in the right direction. So next, I'm going to go into the solution we actually built to tackle this trust and risk issue here. This will look pretty similar if you've ever used some like scanning service before. You can view recent scans for extensions that people have made, or search an extension by a name or extension ID here. And when you search an extension at the top, you'll see a overview of the extension. And in browser extension security, context matters a lot, because an extension can have access to read your data on all sites. And if it's your password manager, that probably makes sense, right? It needs to fill in your passwords, and there's a number of extensions where something like that would make sense. However, if it's a Justin Bieber wallpaper and it has that same amount of permissions, it's maybe cause for concern, and you need to dig in deeper. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to programmatically determine what an extension is supposed to do and adjust your determination based on that. So we still need human eyes on this now. But at the top, you can see a short description of the extension. You can see who it's offered by, contact info if the developer lists it, number of active users, a website, privacy policy, support site. You can view the extension source right in the browser if you would like. You can check out old versions as well. When evaluating browser extensions, we also look a lot at like good faith from developers, where they don't need to list contact information on the web store, but if they do, it's just another data point for us to be like, maybe they are doing the right thing, and we can trust them a bit more. Oh, also really quick with privacy policy, it's not enough that an extension has one, although it's really great to see. You also need somebody to look at the privacy policy. I'm not saying a lawyer needs to spend 3 months reviewing it, but I've seen malicious extensions that have privacy policies that are either boilerplate, or they say they're good about things and just aren't, or they straight up say, like, we're going to be sending your data somewhere. And without looking at that, you wouldn't know. All right, so next is one of the most controversial parts of Crexcavator. And that's that we take a stab at assigning a quantitative risk score to each extension. And we break it down by different sections. And these aren't only the sections that risk can be scored on. And I'm going to be going in a lot deeper on risk scoring towards the end of this presentation. But we take a stab at assigning these risk scores and chart them here, and even provide small descriptions of like, oh, like it's 1 point of risk because the email's missing from the web store. But where I think it's a bit more useful is the risk over time section here. So when you have this number, you can plot it across all the different versions and kind of see where the extension is trending. And you can see at the beginning, LastPass had a big drop in risk score, which I'll go over in a little bit. But if you are looking at this and you see a big spike, it could maybe mean that the extension has changed hands, or there's a new update and it can access more data, which you might want to look into, because there's not really a good way to know when an extension has a new update. Or if it's trending down, it's usually a good sign that the developer is taking security a bit more seriously. Next, we have the permission section. So we show some of those permission warnings I was talking about a bit earlier, but we also show all the individual permissions and sort them by risk. We determine the risk of these extensions. Other people might have different thoughts on what's more risky and what's not. That's part of the problem that I'll talk about a bit later. But we can see, LastPass can interact with your web requests and modify them. It can read your data on all sites pretty much. It can read your tabs and do a lot of other stuff. But next is optional permissions. So I mentioned earlier that optional permissions are the same as permissions, but a user has to click yes or no. But we actually score these risk-wise the same as normal permissions, even though these are technically like it's better security hygiene to have these here. And that's because in the context of allowing an extension for our org, it's really all or nothing. And we can't allow LastPass, for example, and say, hey, users, like, this is fine, but if it ever asks to read your cookies, you have to say no. That's just an unreasonable ask for users. And that's why we score these the same. But you might not have known that. I think this has changed, but older versions of LastPass could. If it asks, read your cookies, your browsing history, change your privacy settings, and communicate with native applications. Next is the Retire.js vulnerability scan that we show here. We run Retire.js, which finds vulnerabilities in third-party libraries and surface them as well. I want to point out that LastPass is no longer, does not include these vulnerable libraries anymore. This is on an older version. We actually scanned LastPass, was the very first extension we scanned with Excavator. And before it was publicly released, we found these, we talked to LastPass, and we were able to have a conversation with them because they're a vendor of ours. And like, hey, we found these vulnerabilities. Are you vulnerable to them? What's the deal? And they said, we know about these. They're included in an old version of the UI that's still bundled with the extension but isn't used. We're not vulnerable. And that they were removing them shortly. And sure enough, we were able to verify with Excavator that they did. I want to note, though, that with browser extensions, when there are vulnerabilities in the libraries that they use, it's more often the case, well, it's not so much that the extensions are exploitable with these vulnerabilities. It's more the case that they don't have great security hygiene of updating these libraries, but it's still something you don't necessarily want to see. Next, we have the content security policy. So with browser extensions, we often want to know, well, in a perfect world, we want to know what they're actually doing. But unfortunately, that's very hard to determine. So we take the next best thing and determine what they can do, what they have permissions to do, and assume the worst. But oftentimes, permission or extensions have way too many permissions, but there's still a valid business use case for them. So we need to try to gain some more confidence in that extension. And content security policy can help with this, because it's not required for an extension to have one of these. But if they add one and voluntarily restrict where they're allowed to send data or load resources from, it can help. I want to also point out, it's out of scope from this talk, but extensions can potentially get around some of the content security policy restrictions. So it's not the end-all be-all if they can only send data or have only one entry in here. But it's still good to see. We also use this section to determine if this is really just communicating with some SaaS service somewhere. And if I didn't know anything about LastPass, I would see, yes, this is communicating with this lastpass.com, excuse me, and likely need to reach out to them and start a vendor review process. Additionally, we scan these entries through VirusTotal. If you have a VirusTotal key and threat exchange keys added to your group in Excavator. But like I said, unfortunately, extensions aren't required to define these. And if they don't, we still want to know what it might be communicating with. And that's where the potential external communication section comes in. So potential external communication takes a stab at assessing what the extension might be talking to by searching for HTTP or HTTPS wrapped in quotes in the JavaScript. We're working on a V2 of this that does true AST parsing and does a better job of trying to compute where it's sending, like what the actual URL that it's sending to is, and we're going to run those through threat intel, but I don't have a good date on that.
I'm presuming like HTTPS://raw by itself is just, it's probably a string that's concatenated or something else so that you haven't been able to identify the specifics. Is that a fair example of that?
Yeah, 100%. And that's kind of what we're looking to solve with that. And we have some preliminary beta code working, but it's a bit more compute intensive than we originally planned. So we have to do some fun stuff there. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Did you have more? Oh, okay. So let's say we still don't know anything about LastPass, and the content security policy wasn't there. We can see at the top there's this like UI prod service, so it might be communicating with that. We also see LastPass appear a lot here as well. We see log me in, which is either the current or former owner of LastPass. We see some other stuff which might have just been included in some other libraries. And we don't score risk on this section because there's a number of false positives. The next section is the manifest, where you can dig in deeper here if you fully want to explore that. We also have related extensions. So maybe you weren't happy with LastPass and want to look up something else. And if you're signed in and added your org's allowed extensions, it'll also show you allowed related extensions. So maybe instead of telling the user, well, instead of allowing LastPass, you could just tell the user to use like 1Password instead if it's already allowed in your org. Okay, so I just talked a lot about what the Crexcavator risk report looks like. I'm going to go a lot quicker through the enterprise section here because I'm not trying to convince y'all to deploy Crexcavator throughout your orgs, but I think it's still worth seeing to speak to the last goal y'all have of kind of determining the provenance of for y'all open source libraries, but for us Chrome extensions throughout our org. Crexcavator's API first, because we like to automate stuff at Duo, and we don't necessarily want to have another pane of glass that we have to look at all the time. So you can get API keys. You can add your thread intel keys and set up webhooks, and I'll go over what some of this is for in a little bit. You can add your group's allowed extensions here. So if you do that, you can also view our dashboard, which can show you what your highest risk extensions are. This is another area where I think the risk score is valuable, where if you're in an org that has 500, 5,000, or even 50,000 extensions, you can use risk score as a priority mechanism to determine what extensions you should look at first and potentially remove. And we sort those by risk there on high risk. And also recently updated, since extensions will automatically update, you can look at this to know when there was a new update and what the change in risk is. And you can see Grammarly, shout out to them, they really restricted their CSP in that update. But if it was red and it added 300 points of risk or something, maybe you should dig into that and see if you should still allow it. Next, we have extension user statistics. So we actually have a helper Chrome extension called Crexcavator Gatherer that can collect browser extension usage data throughout your org and report it back to Crexcavator. And with that, you can know who has what extensions installed. And this is handy if you can see some extensions only have one user. And if that's the case, maybe it's not really a great business use case and you can remove it. Or where this really shines is when a extension that you've allowed turns out to be malicious. You can see who had that installed and maybe see it's only 5 users and none of them had production access, and you can feel a bit safer knowing that things could have been worse. But if you know what extensions people are using, you also know what they're not using. So you can these are extensions that were previously allowed and in use, but nobody currently has them installed. Maybe a user left the company. Maybe there's no longer a valid use case for it. You can probably remove these from your allowed list without much friction. Finally, on the dashboard, we have the extension request section. So we like to make things as easy as possible on our users at Duo, and we don't want them to always have to email us to allow an extension. So our helper browser extension can detect when you are viewing a extension install page that is not currently allowed in in your org and throw this notification. If you click it, this pops up and you can type in a business justification and request approval. And then this is where webhooks come in, because you might not want to live on this table here. And you could have it like automatically create a Zendesk ticket or something. And then users can easily request stuff that way. It's worth noting too, I think Google is adding or has already added official support for this in Chrome, which is cool to see, as well as adding more APIs around browser extensions for G Suite. Okay, whew. So I sped through the Crexcavator report and some of the more enterprisey features that Crexcavator has. But now I want to spend some time talking about the challenges that we found with trying to assess risk and trust in this way. And by far the biggest one is this. What's a good risk score? This is the number one question I have gotten since we've launched Crexcavator, and there's not really a good answer to this. And that's because in this context, the question / the underlying framework is flawed. Or like even day one, when we released Crexcavator, somebody tweeted at us like, "Hey, this is awesome, good to see. Like I just scanned some privacy news app, and I take it a rating of 425 is not good." And they're right in thinking like is 425 good? Is it bad? It seems high. But we don't give them any scale to assess that. And that's because when I talked about earlier that the context of the extension matters, where is it supposed to read all my data or is it not supposed to? There's a few more challenges, which I'm going to go over in a sec. But we see orgs like really like the fact that there is some numeric risk score. Because when they have a number, they're able to do so many things. They're able to, create reports, write automation, have some charts and graphs, and have this control over this problem that they didn't necessarily have before. But because of some of the flaws with the risk score, you should not write some system where any extension over 425 is not allowed. Anything over 200 is manual review, and anything under 200 is allowed. But we see orgs want to do this, and that's because that's kind of intuitive. And if I didn't know better, I'd probably write something similar myself. And that comes into the problem with assigning numerical risk to something that is more qualitative or opinion-based. Because even just looking within the permissions category here, how do you assess the risk from one permission to another? How do you compare the risk you get from being able to send the user a notification versus being able to read the user's history? I'd say I'd probably be more concerned about an extension reading my history, but then how does that compare to an extension being able to read my privacy settings, right? Everyone would have a different opinion and different thoughts on it. And, Duo's risk score was created a while ago, and it worked internally for us. But when we released this publicly and more people started using it, we found it's tough to provide all the context that we have around risk scores to all of our users. And even if you look beyond just a single category, like how do you compare the risk from permissions to content security policy? And content security policy is one of the examples here on what can kind of go wrong with risk scoring and with the community, where the content security policy has an interesting story on how it's scored the way it does. Or essentially, there's so many different knobs you can turn and levers you can pull with the CSP, and we wanted to it's without looking at what's behind a certain domain in a CSP. There is some certainty you can say behind this CSP is more secure than this CSP based on the number of entries and what's restricted. And that's why the algorithm for CSP risk scoring is fairly complex, where every entry in any section of a CSP gets 1 point of risk. But if there's a star in the entry, it gets 5 points of risk. An example of this is like, let's say you have api.lastpass.com. Well, that's more secure than having star.lastpass.com. But then what happens if you have API 1, API 2, API 3, and you have more than 5? Well, then you get into the scenario where it's technically more secure for you to list each one individually, but you're penalized via the risk score by having more than 5 entries there. And maybe if you're trying to optimize for risk score, you just put the star entry. Also, with the default, or sorry, with a missing section of the CSP, you'll get 25 points of risk. But what if you have more than 25 entries in there? Or what if you have like 5 or 6 entries, but they're all star entries, right? And we created this unfortunate scenario where people were optimizing either for risk score or for security, and they weren't necessarily getting the results that they expected. But in order to be this granular, we had to increase the like maximum amount of risk the CSP can give. And that's why if you forget a CSP, you'll get 377 points of risk, because it's 25 times 15, which is the number of sections in the CSP, plus a few extra for some default stuff. But the way we score permissions, which is arguably has a much higher impact on the security of an extension. Kind of like how somebody can win the electoral college with just 25% of the vote, technically, right? You can have an extension that has a risk score of 15, which is from the HTTPS permission, and it can read all of your data, and assuming everything else is fairly locked down, versus an extension that doesn't have that permission, but just forgot their CSP, and then has a risk score of 337, which doesn't really line up at all. And you could do things like, well, maybe we start adding zeros to the risks that permissions give, right? Instead of 15, it's 150 or it's 1500. But then we start getting into positions where extensions have a risk score of, you're comparing 54,000 to 47,000, and risk scores start to have even less meaning. And we've wanted to be very careful on how we change the risk score. We've changed risk score twice since we've released Crexcavator, and it's been either improving the CSP risk scoring or removing risk scoring on that potential external communication section. And we don't want to keep changing something and seeing if that's better, because users have already implemented flows with this, and we want to be careful how quickly we change things, since it's not just Duo anymore. We've considered a few other approaches.
If I can jump in real quick. I don't actually see a crisis in penalizing somebody who doesn't even put in a CSP. I mean, granted, it's probably overstating the risk, but it does suggest someone isn't paying attention at all.
That's exactly what we were thinking of when we first did this. Mm-hmm. But we found that it affects. So if you go on Crexcavator and you look at risk scores, you'll see a lot of them are around 300 and 400. And that's because a lot of extensions don't define CSPs or have very open ones. And what happens there is when every extension is around 300, 400, you lose some of the other granularity of either vulnerabilities or specifically permissions, which in our current flow, permissions are probably scored way too low. But you have this trade-off between trying to pressure developers into doing the right thing and rewarding them for having CSPs. And we've seen examples of developers who wanted to lower risk scores. And if you look up Crexcavator on GitHub for people including the word Crexcavator in comments and merge requests, you can see people have used Crexcavator reports to encourage extension developers to add CSPs and do stuff like this. There's an example I can't share, but popular extensions have been pushed in the direction of security due to Crexcavator, but it penalizes users of Crexcavator by muddying the waters a bit on what the risk score, like just harder to compare extensions, I think, which is why this is a tough problem. But anyway, we've considered a few other approaches like multiplicative risk scores, like maybe extensions, the permissions multiply the risk from other sections because it amplifies like what the risk might be, or even vice versa. But this was just getting too hand wavy and arbitrary. You could cap risk scores of different categories. So then maybe each section is just a 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100 or something. But then we've seen pressure from developers that they want a gold star for every improvement they make to their extension. You could switch to letter grades, but that's just a reskinned like risk score essentially. You could let orgs define
worse actually, because if I didn't get an A, I would not expect LastPass to have no risk.
Yeah,
that would be silly. I mean, fundamentally, what access it needs is much stronger. I have to trust it in a way that I would not trust Joe average extension, and that's okay.
Yeah, and you know we've LastPass shouldn't have 0 points of risk, and there's a reason we've been using risk scoring, and users still think risk equals like maliciousness. They're thinking more of us as virus total, good, bad versus risk. And we've even considered making it potential risk, like trying to add more fluff to like have users see that this is like a high risk score isn't inherently bad, but just because we have users, I've had librarians CC me while sending a Crexcavator report to extension developers, asking me to tell their developers to lower their risk score, when it's really not like, it's kind of like that one commercial, like that's not how any of this works kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So being that like authority to assign these risk scores has created problems, and that's why we've considered letting orgs define their own risk. And this functionality isn't like technically supported in the UI, but because Crexcavator is API first, and people are smart, they could easily fetch a report and then just change the risk scores based on the data we provide. Or we've even considered just dropping risk scores altogether, because the answer we give to what's a good risk score is that depends. And you really have to look at why the extension is getting the risk that it does, and what the extension is supposed to do, and make a determination based on your org's risk profile, really. And that leads me to the end of the pres here. And hopefully I was able to provide some context for y'all on the mind of a consumer who had a problem with in this case Chrome extensions, but I could have easily been asked to write a Crexcavator for open source libraries, and one kind of exists, I forget the name of it, but we had a problem with being able to trust these, and this was the solution we created, and we've seen a lot of interest from many organizations, and we're happy with the change that we were able to effect, and it's provided a lot of value for us. But there's definitely been a lot of road bumps along the way, and we're still learning every day. So with that, if y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Or if you think of anything later and want to chat, you can email me at jrickard@cisco.com, and I'm always happy to nerd out about browser extensions anytime. Cool. So thank you. Is there any questions I can answer?
Thank you, Jacob. Just a quick question. Do you have contacts on the Google side you don't have to give out names or anything, but if there's anything that I could help support you with, and pushing people, feel free to shoot me an email or something. If there's stuff that you're dying to get implemented or something, I could nudge and see what I can do from my side.
Yeah.
And then more of a comment than a question. I think this was really interesting. It's got a lot of overlap with some of the things that we've been doing, not only in this working group, but we have the scorecard project, I think is the one you're referring to, where we've shied away from giving a numerical risk, and it's more of like a true false of objective data, and like take it what you will, sort of a thing. So thank you again for presenting, and feel free to reach out if I can be of help for anything. Oh, I guess I do have a question. You said this is open. Is it open source? Like, is there help? Well, I'm not sure how if there's things that we could help from the community side. Like, the scorecard is kind of interesting if you wanted to use it to look at dependencies that way, and it gives you, more information about dependencies that these extensions are taking in. But
yeah, so unfortunately, Crexcavator is not open source. I know it's Cardinal Sin presenting to this group here. It's free but not open source. We host it. There's a number of reasons why that I can't necessarily go into fully on this recorded time. Yeah, if there's any real interest in changing something in Crexcavator or learning more about it, we're always open to discussions there. And yeah, I think I'm definitely going to look into the security scorecard project y'all have, because we're always looking to add more widgets into Crexcavator to help give people more data points. So thank you.
Cool. I think we just have one other short topic on the agenda today, unless anyone else has any questions for Jacob. No? All right, Dan, I think this is you.
Cool. Yeah, this is just a quick FYI. In the best practices working group, I noticed that we've got a whole bunch of different things now that recommend people cryptographically sign release artifacts. And every time I've talked to a project that isn't doing this about doing it, they start asking how and what they should use. And there's kind of an overwhelming number of choices on this, and it seems like none of them are good. And so I'm just trying to see if anybody's interested in actually trying to put together a guide of, if you're just trying to publish a binary on GitHub and want to sign it, here's what you should do. Here's how you should, here's a way you can do it. If anybody wants to do anything more powerful, then they're probably not going to ask those questions, but some kind of just minimal viable best practice on that. I'll forward that email over to here too, and we can just see if anybody's interested in working on that. I see a lot of nodding, so.
Yeah, yes, I'd be interested. I'm not sure I wanted to sign up to start it, but once there's something written, I can start kibitzing.
Cool.
Yeah, my name's definitely in the hat.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I suspect you're not going to have for best practices, you're going to have several alternatives. And so eventually I'm expecting that what will be is, first, here are the three options. Use one in this case, use two in this other case.
That's
and then
perfect too. Choose your own adventure kind of thing.
Exactly. I think that'd actually be perfect, actually. Because I'm sure we won't have the one true answer, but if we can tell people what the best answer is for common circumstances, and I'm sure there'll be overlap and whatever, but I love the idea.
Cool. Awesome. All right. I guess that's all for today.
Wait, no, I have one more shameless plug. I can link it here. We just published a blog post on Google's side that touches on some identity stuff at the end. So feel free to read it. It covers a lot about open source software security. So that's of interest. Check it out.
Yeah, and also, I don't think everybody on the call now was on at the beginning. So the first bullet on the agenda, let me replug the awesome stuff that Kim did of summarizing the last number of meetings. So if you haven't read it, please do.
Yeah, did you put that in the chat?
It's on the agenda. I could put it on the chat as well. I know how to copy paste. Oh, look at that. Yeah, but it's good stuff. Kim, thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks for the presenters too. I pinged them all to fill in. I was like, wait a minute, I can speed this up. Go fill in your.
You still led the charge, so you get credit.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jacob. Have
Yeah,
a good
and
day.
oh, by the way, I think next week we're going to have talks about integrating GitHub with OpenSSH and Recore, correct? Is that the plan?
2 weeks.
So next meeting in 2 weeks.
Correct.
All right. Bye.
Thanks for having me on. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.